Thank you very much, Alison, for that wonderful introduction. Makes my book sound really funny. Maybe it is. And thank you also, John, and thank you, John Dedmon, also for making my visit to this beautiful but somewhat chilly city possible. Now, and I begin with an apology. I have put up a title, which has been on the poster and everywhere, that will ring some bells with some of you if you have done any translation studies in the modern manner, because it's the same title as that of a little essay written in 1923 by Walter Benjamin, which remained very obscure for many decades until it suddenly became the flavor of the month from the early 1970s, especially after George Steiner's After Babel. Now, I'm using that title in an entirely dishonest way to draw you all in. I'm not using it so much to honor its author or what he has to say in that essay, but rather to query it, because, and to query its very formulation. Because, you know, one can write about the task of the president, or the task of the chairman, or the task of the electrician, because these are socially constructed positions in society, either based on documents or on practices, on a whole network of things that mean that that is a meaningful question as to what is the task of the president. But there is no constitution of the translatorship. There is no social discourse about what a translator should or should not do. And so I don't really think of myself as the translator. I am a translator, and I'm going to talk about four of the tasks that a translator, namely this translator, has had to face and undertake, and then perhaps to generalize and in question and answer we can maybe move towards some more general perceptions on this issue. So my four stories are from tiny little details from four different books. The only thing they really have in common is that they have been translated into English from French. Some of them have in common also the fact that the translator was me, but not in all cases. The first story I'm going to tell you comes from a job I took on a couple of years ago to help with the relaunch of Georges Simenon in English. Penguin Books in London did an amazing thing. They bought the world rights to the whole of the Simenon estate, and in collaboration with his heir, who is his son, John Simenon, who is an Englishman who lives in Switzerland, to retranslate this vast work. Simenon was extremely prolific novelist. Some of it's really quite good too. So anyway, they have got a 25-year translation program ahead of them, and they wanted me to do the first one to set the tone. That was quite a burden, quite an honor, but at the same time, not a very difficult task, because it's a little novelette written in 1931. It's interesting, and it's the first of the series because this is the first full-length story in which a character called Maigret actually appears as the focal character. He'd been sort of adumbrated in some short stories the year before, but this was the one where Simenon said, yeah, I got a good thing there, and made a novel out of him. And he went on to write 74 more Maigret novels. So translating it was really like setting up the boundaries, if you like, of the kind of discourse that's going to be used to remake Simenon in English for the 21st century. Now, Simenon wrote that novel in 10 days flat. He wrote most of his novels in 10 days. There are 10 chapters, nearly all the Maigrets are 10 or 11 chapters, and he would do chapter a day. And then he would do nothing for 3 months and wander around feeling miserable until it came on him again, and he just had to get it out. So he was a writer who worked like that. Very strange, very unusual. So I thought, well, if he can write this in 10 days, I can do it. So I did a chapter a day. And you know, in that sense, it's easy, but what I really want to tell you about was one point where I could have spent the whole of the day on 2 words, I could have spent the whole of the week on 2 words, I could have spent a year on 2 words, and I'm now going to spend 15 minutes just on 2 words. Maigret, our French sleuth, head of the Flying Brigade, Brigade Mobile, is standing in a bar in a rather posh part of Paris, waiting for his sidekick, Dufour, who's a younger detective, about whom Miguel feels rather kindly towards him, but also a bit sort of hostile towards him because he's too clever. He speaks foreign languages, which is something Miguel doesn't really approve of. But anyway, Dufour is late. He's supposed to be keeping tabs on the suspect's girlfriend. And Maigret, standing at the bar, puffs his pipe, sips his petit vin blanc, and says under his breath, "Sacré Dufour." Now, sacré is an adjective with the dictionary meaning of sacred, holy, but like many such words in French, as in English, it's lost a great deal of its semantic content, and it's really just an intensifier. It's an expletive word. It's an intensifier of affect. And like many words of that sort, and I'm sure you can think of some immediately in your head, words that you're not actually going to say aloud here, where affective words, expletives, can have either a negative or a positive polarity. Yeah? There can be plus words and minus words at the same time. I'm sure that is true of many languages. But the vocabulary of affect is often entirely bipolar. For example, at a soccer match, when the centre forward scores a goal with an unbelievable kick from midfield, you can scream out, "Sacré Zidane! What a tremendous guy he is." Okay? Or alternatively, in situations that aren't that different, really, I mean, you can shout or mutter the word "sacré" to express disgust, or even hostility, like digging your car up a snowdrift in the drive, and there's that "sacré boulot." Well, it's there in English, but it's just quite rude. And when it suddenly thaws immediately thereafter, you can say that was a sacré perte de temps, a waste of time. So sacré on its own, it's an affective word, but you don't know whether it's positive or negative. Of course, in actual speech, realized or internal, in a context, you do know. But context is an extremely fuzzy concept. I mean, people who teach translation and talk about translation often say, it's the context important. But I say, well, what is context? Context can be almost anything. Here, it can be pitch, volume, stress, if it's a spoken thing, or internalized pitch, volume, and stress, even actual elocution, the amount of s in sacré. Context can include what you already know about the individual saying it, the relationship between the participants in the speech event, their attitudes to each other or to whatever it is that gave rise to that speech event. Context is just a great catch-all word that means nothing. How you determine which bits of the infinite context of any utterance are actually relevant to disambiguating sacré, that's the problem, because many of the props to the interpretation of a word in actual usage are there in speech, but they're not there in writing, and they're even less there in fiction. And they're even less there in speech represented in writing in fiction, because it is in the speech represented in the writing in the fiction that constitutes the fiction, and therefore the affect itself. Okay? So sacré du four, what Miguel says to himself doesn't of itself, in and for itself, mean anything. You have to decide, as a translator, also as a reader. And as a translator, you are a reader, and a reader, you are actually a translator anyway. So what might it mean? What do we want it to mean? Well, Maigret is standing in a bar, he's waiting for his sidekick, he thinks quite well of the young man, at the same time he's a bit sniffy about him. He might mean that he's irritated with him being late. He might be expressing his admiration for this younger man who, by keeping tabs on this suspect's girlfriend, is going to turn into a real detective one day. Who knows? You can't be sure. Now, when you read this is called a translation crux, and when you parting of the ways, Often, of course, with a written text, when you reach that sort of part of the way, you can cheat, you can read the rest of the text, and what happens next, or after next may give you retrospective illumination, and so you say, aha, now I know, you go back and change it, so it's sort of cheating, but that is how writers write and how translators translate. Unfortunately, in this particular context, something else happens in that bar next. In fact, the suspect himself walks in, and the plot takes a different turn, and so we get no retrospective illumination on whether Maigret was actually irritated or approving of Dufour. So what do you do? Well, in the long tradition of Western translation practice, there are various bottom-of-the-barrel solutions to the problem of what you do when you don't know what something means. The oldest one in the book, and it is the oldest book from the Septuagint, is, well, you just leave it in the original. Okay, that is why the Oxford English Dictionary has entries for cherubim and seraphim, which are mispronounced masculine plural Hebrew words from biblical Hebrew that were just represented in the Greek of the Septuagint in transcription, and then by St. Jerome in Latin transcription, and then by Tyndall and everybody else in English as transcriptions of the Latin. Each time pronunciation changes, but the script form doesn't, or just it changes alphabet. And the result is nobody knows what happened to these words. They never did, and they never will, because all you've got is just the words transported. Okay, it's called a Xenism, a slightly different, but not completely different, version of the same translation or non-translation tactic you get with foreign words used in English as fairly opaque Xenisms as part of a special jargon, as part of the language of a particular trade or set of ideas, like Hegel's Aufhebung or Derrida's Difference. It sort of looks like you understand what they mean, but the reason that you don't translate them is that you don't know what they mean, because if you did, you translate them. Okay? Oh yes, obviously. I mean, you know, it announces that these are not things that you can really understand properly. A third example of the same thing that is, again, a little bit different is what are called decorative Xenisms, where when you're translating Dumas, you know, with the Three Musketeers of Count of Monte Cristo, you know, you have characters saying parbleu and saperlipopette in English, or when you're making yet another Hollywood movie about the Second World War, your Nazi officers speak perfect English, but every now and again you burst out with jawohl. Heil Hitler. Yeah. These are decorative Xenisms that constitute they're kind of functional. Okay, so they're all technically the same device, from cherubim through parbleu to Aufhebung and jawohl. They're technically the same, but as you can see, they have slightly different. They construct slightly differently in terms of what they're doing. The cherubim thing is just completely opaque. The jawohl is not, because it's used in circumstances where it's self-translating. Otherwise, you wouldn't dare in Hollywood put in a foreign word that your audience didn't understand. So, as a translator of Simenon, stuck on Sacré du Four, I could follow in that tradition and just put in Sacré du Four, I suppose, as a decorative Xenism. But then it would also be a little bit like an opaque Xenism too, because it is not possible to say what it means in and of itself. However, a translator is always constrained by the conventions of the genre into which you are translating, and current conventions of the genre of detective fiction are that foreign sleuths, whether they're Scandinavian or Italian or French, speak English. That's the convention. So I didn't feel free to do that, to Frenchify Simenon by putting in bits of French for him to speak, because that would construct him in a way that is not really what I think either Penguin or John Simenon want him to be in English. So he has to speak English. In doing that, I'm following that other tradition that comes to us from Homer, which is to forget the foreignness of the Trojans. You may realize that in the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Trojans speak excellent Greek, and there's not a single mention of the foreignness of foreigners' tongues. And so detective fiction is, It's neither biblical nor epic, but if you have to choose in terms of your tradition, I suppose epic is more suitable than biblical. Okay, so we set aside Sacré du Four as a translation of Sacré du Four. That we're not going to allow ourselves. So it's indeterminate in its polarity. A translator has the task of deciding which polarity it is going to have in English. You make a choice. And it's not a completely arbitrary choice. I mean, you know, it's not just picking it out of a hat. But all the same, any choice made is always, to some degree, perhaps a small degree, but to some degree, a reflection of the person making that choice. If I were in a Paris bar waiting for my sidekick to turn up and he was late, I would be irritated. And my decision in the translation of this novel that actually Maigret was annoyed rather than appreciative of Dufour, you know, in a tiny way, it reflects me because it's how I would prefer him to be, because it just seems more like me. I do want to stress this: it isn't an entirely subjective choice. It is constrained. It's constrained by the French language, the English, all sorts of things. But it's a little bit subjective. I mean, in the end, a translator cannot hide behind dictionaries and reference works all the time, and he can be flushed out and has to make a choice, even in a text as straightforward as a Simenon novel, and even in a locus as trivial as a little expletive said in a bar. But that, of course, is not the end of the story, because given, after this lengthy introduction, the decision that actually, yeah, Maigret is annoyed. How does Maigret express annoyance? Well, depends who he is. I mean, in English, perhaps more richly than in other languages, but I'm sure in all languages to some degree, expressions of annoyance, like all expletive or affective language, is highly coded for gender, age, social and economic class, professional circumstances, region, so that by deciding what Maigret is going to say for Sacré du Four, you are deciding all those things about Monsieur Maigret, of which you only know some at this point, because we are in the very first Maigret novel. We are at the beginning of the development of a character who will acquire other characteristics. So here are some of the choices. Now, if Maigret were an Edwardian lady detective, well, so that's a statue of Maigret in Holland. It's allegedly on the spot where Maigret was first invented, but I don't really believe it. Yes, we can see. Oh dear, what a nuisance, I say. If Maigret were, I don't know, a plainclothes policeman in Prime Suspect, might have said, damn, you're right. And if Maigret were a member of the New York Police Department, probably would have said it. So you most certainly would have said that, okay? But the trouble is, Maigret is not an Edwardian lady, and he is not an NYPD officer, and he doesn't actually speak English anyway. So, he's an inspector in the French flying squad circa 1931. So I use this as a comical way of just reminding you that translated fiction is doubly fictional. All translated fiction, especially where dialogue's involved but not only, takes you into a kind of conventional metaspace where people speak the wrong language, and you know it's the wrong language, but you don't mind, somehow or other. I don't know why we don't mind, we don't. So that's the real crux for the translator, the real parting of the ways. What kind of expression is Maigret going to use? And it's absolutely crucial. It's crucial because whatever words are chosen, they will tell you more than anything else who Maigret is. So, you know, because we don't have his voice, we don't have any of the other props to identity because it's just on paper, the words that are attributed to him in direct speech, and particularly in affective and expletive language, are going to construct the identity of a new doubly fictional character called Maigret in English. And, well, that's a terrible responsibility. I mean, maybe some people would say it's not nearly as serious as deciding whether Gregor Samsa, in Kafka's Metamorphosis, turns into a beetle or a roach or just some kind of an insect, which is the latest Bronowski translation. But actually, I think it's even more serious, because this is a guy who's going to go on for 75 more novels, and this is where he starts, and where you have to judge the level of vulgarity, the level of energy, that's going to mold how the whole of the rest of this great saga develops. And so, well, no point thinking about it for too long, but there's no point thinking about it for too long, but you have to be self-aware. The task of the translator is to be aware that he or she is making a choice, is actually, well, being just a little bit creative. You are actually writing Mégret for a second time, and he's not the same Mégret as the one that was written by Georges Simenon. Okay. End of my story about 2 words. We'll come back to it later as to what it really means, what it exhibits. I think I've probably said enough already about that. Switch to something that looks much simpler. Les Misérables. Book I'm rather fond of. Very long book. It's about all sorts of things. It's also about money. It's a novel about poor people and also people who, being poor, get rich. And so money is mentioned quite a lot. There are about 300 quanta of money mentioned in the space of the book. You might say that's dead easy. I mean, money is just like all metrics. Kilometers and miles, you've got the little table telling one to the other. Francs are francs, what's the problem? I mean, it really is very simple for 19th century France because, you know, pity the poor translator of Dickens into French, where you have to learn, you know, that 4 farthings make a penny, 12 pence make a shilling, and 20 shillings make a pound. Pence is written D, and shillings written S, and pound is written L. And that 5 shillings make a crown, and 21 shillings make a guinea. And a pound can also be called a sovereign. And the old rhyme my father taught me, you know, 6 pennies make a tanner, 2 tanners make a bob, 3 make 18 pence, and 4 2 bob. It's totally incomprehensible. And to put that into French, well, thank goodness, that's not my problem. My problem is with something much simpler. Napoleon reformed French currency in 1803, and from that point on, there's a bimetallic system using silver and gold, a fixed proportion between them, 100 centimes to a franc, and that's it, and no francs. Lasted for over 100 years, and jolly good for Napoleon. So every sum of money mentioned in Les Misérables is expressible in that unit, or those units. There's no ambiguity, we know what they are. The trouble is that in the 19th century, French people did not speak of them using those words. There were 3 overlapping money nomenclatures that had quite profound social meaning. So on the left there is the official money terms, okay? But those official money terms were only used for official money. That's say fines, taxes, government stipends, and a few other calculations that had to do with the state and with official things. For the people, for les misérables, for the poor, there was a quite different money. It had a precise conversion, and we know what it means, but it wasn't spoken of in francs. The unit for the poor is un sou. A sou is entirely notional. There were no sou coins. Yeah? You couldn't take out a sou. Yeah? It's a notional unit, 1/20th of a franc. Yeah? So 1 franc is 20 sous, 2 francs is 40 sous, 40 sous, and the highest value silver coin in circulation is the 5 franc coin, and that was the pièce de 100 sous, the coin of 100 sous. And all sums mentioned by poor people, people who are not bourgeois or higher, are computed in sous. There was also a, not exactly slang word, but a current word for 100 sous. It was called a monarque, because it had the monarch's head on it. Right. Well, that you might say, that's all right. We can have sous for the poor and francs for the rich, but no, you can't. It's a little more subtle than that. Incidentally, the 20-base counting system is really interesting. It runs through many, many things in French. It's a trace of an ancient Roman and probably Celtic 20-based arithmetic that's still there. In contemporary French, sou is a word that people know as a money term, but nobody knows how much it is unless they live in Geneva. Okay, you say des sous means money, or ça vaut pas un sou, it's not worth a penny, but it's lost any reference to number. In Geneva, however, a sou is quite precisely 5 Swiss centimes. Remember, like German Rappen. But, you know, the French and the Swiss don't talk to each other very much. Especially not now. So there are some of these coins, I'll show you. And I hope you're beginning to see what a really interesting issue this is for translation. I mean, the problem is not expressing these money values in present-day terms. Translations of novels don't do that. The problem is rather different, because for the rich, there was a whole other language. Gee, where's my other thingy? There we are. If money is received as interest, dividend, rent, or a stipend above a certain level, such as a bishop's stipend in the opening of Misérables, 1 franc is not called un franc, it's called une livre. You have so many livres de rente, you know, of income. The livre is exactly equivalent to the franc, but using the word livre, you know, places you in a particular social context, a particular language of money that is not the same as the other language of money. So the same coin, you know, for a poor person is 100 sous, for the government it is 5 francs, and for the bourgeois who receives it as rent or income, it is 5 livres. But it's not actually, because if you call a franc a livre, then to name 5 francs, you say écu. And that's in the 19th century. It's very confusing, because in the 18th century, an écu was worth 3 francs. But in the 19th century, but those francs were worth something different anyway. But in the 19th century, once you switch from Manon Lescaut to Les Misérables, you've got to change your number conversion. So you have écu. And then, of course, France has a long tradition also, which is quite foreign into the English-speaking world, of naming quanta by the effigy that appears on the coin that represents that quanta. Yeah? So like, you know, you had Lincolns and Jacksons in your pocket. And how much is a Franklin? We don't do it. We don't do it. But the French did it for hundreds of years. So since the 5 franc coin was the largest value silver coin in circulation, it had the head of the king on it, and it was therefore called un louis. So we now have 5 words for the same quantum, and they will have different meanings. The louis is the coin, but it's also the quantum. The écu is the quantum, it's not the coin. Okay, 100 sous means that you're talking small money and have only small money, and 5 francs means that it's either a fine or a tax or something official. Now, these meanings are not explained in Les Misérables because in the 19th century everybody knew this, they operated in that. How do you represent any of that in English? How do you represent the fact that the only gold coin in circulation is the Napoleon, it's worth 20 francs, and it's referred to as a Napoleon. But after 1815, of course, when Napoleon fell and Louis XVIII came back, the new king minted some more gold coins, and of course they had his head on it. So they were also called louis. So un louis may be 5, and it may be 20. And Napoleon also minted some double Napoleons, twice the size of the Napoleons, worth 40 francs, and called, when you needed to disambiguate them, double Napoleon. But of course you didn't need to disambiguate them in practice, because it's twice the same. You can well tell it's made of gold, it's twice up, etc. So all this doesn't really matter in actual life in the 19th century, because 5 francs is 5 francs. It's made of 5 francs worth of silver, and 20 francs is 20 francs worth of gold. But when it's written down in a novel, when you do not have those pretty things to disambiguate, where did I show you? There you are. That's a golden louis worth 20 francs, and that's the pièce de 40 sous. It says 2 francs on it, but when Petit Gervais, the little lad from the Alps, has his coin stolen from him by Valjean, fairly near the beginning of part 1, and he said, "Give me back my pièce de 40 sous." Now, it doesn't say 40 on it, it says 2 on it, but he's an uneducated, illiterate lad, but he can multiply by 20 in his head, as could everybody. It was like just part of the language, multiplying and dividing by 20. Okay? So the problem is to bring this up to date, to make it meaningful to a modern readership, in English and in French, because most contemporary French readers don't know any of what I just told you, and read Les Misérables in complete haze as to what's really going on. There is a really fabulous thing that's going on at one point, where, I don't know how well you remember the musical, but Marius is the jeune premier, the tenor. He has some political ideas that his grandfather really dislikes, so they have a squabble and he walks out because he tries to live on his own. He's only 19, and his grandfather, who is a curmudgeonly old soul, but actually is really rather fond of the boy, decides he shouldn't starve, and so he sends him, through the agency of his sister, a purse to keep him going. But being a very old man and being very sort of keen on his status as a fossil of the Ancien Régime, the last surviving sort of, mastodonte of the pre-revolutionary France, he uses an even more obsolete money term. He says, take these 60 pistoles. And pistole is a Spanish coin of the 17th century that hadn't actually had any currency in France for God knows how long, but it had a notional value as a multiple of francs. So he knew what he was talking about. And in the relevant part of the novel, Marius receives these 60 pistoles, and of course he won't accept them, he's far too proud, being a young hothead, and he sends back 30 louis. Now, as a reader, but of course as a translator even more, you have to have a judgment as to whether that's a fair swap or short change. You need to do the sums before you know what the hell it is you're translating and what's going on at this point in the novel. Okay? And in fact, in order to know that, you have to know all of what I've just told you, and you need the key number 10. Pistole was held to be the name of 10 francs. Okay? And there you have to, 30 louis, they have to be golden ones, yeah? And so, it's a fair swap. It's 600 francs, both ways round. Oof. Okay? So, task of the translator. Walter Benjamin didn't have any idea about this sort of thing. The task of a translator must also be able to count like Cosette, because even a sweet young thing with a convent education could do all these sums in her head. It was just natural. It was part of living in the 19th century. But obviously, a translator's second task is to decide what to do about them. Now, one really kind thing you could do to the reader of the novel is to translate them all, not into English, but into Francs. Yeah? Standard. French readers would be so grateful, because then they could look at the English translation to discover what their French novel means. You think I'm joking? It happens a lot. Not so much with the Misérables, but there are lots of texts where we use, and foreigners use, their translations in another language as elucidations, to a degree, clarifications, since translators cannot avoid clarifying. You can't, as it were, translate obscurity by obscurity. I mean, it's just you're in a complete tangle if you try to do that, and nobody wants to read you anyway. So what do you do? One imaginable extension of the translator's conventional task in cases like this is to add to it a pedagogical wing called translator's notes or translator's introduction, where you lay out the little chart that I've given you with as much detail or illustration as you want, and then leave the original terms in the translated novel and leave it to the reader to learn and to. In the case of the money, I think you would need a whole introduction rather than just one footnote, because there's just too many terms and complications. But you see, I mean, there are lots of texts, and not just novels, where, how should we say, translating is not quite enough, because texts refer to things in the real world, and these things have no equivalent, they have no imaginable correspondence in any other language, because they're constructed out of words that refer to objects, but they are their own almost autonomous system. And there's no point inventing, as a one-off, an English language set of equivalences for livre, écu, sans sou, monarque. And you could, but it would really be utterly pointless to do it just for one book. Even if you're translating the whole of Balzac's Comédie Humaine, where all these problems are the same in Comédie Humaine, again, to have just the Balzac's money language in English dress, I think it would be, well, maybe a good idea? No, I think it would be futile, because it would, in any case, not have the social historical depth that the words have in French. It wouldn't correspond to these class-based and professional-based usages. So it wouldn't tell you what the French is actually telling you by using those conventional systems. Okay, that's my second example, where translation has to go beyond itself, or fall short of itself. But saying, what is the translation is a slightly odious question. Third example. Also quasi-pedagogic, also a kind of extension, but a bit more fun. If you find money boring, this is a bit more fun. I recently translated a short, rather elegant novel by Paul Fournel, who is, as Alison mentioned, president of the Oulipo, a French writers group that uses or makes use of formal constraints of various different kinds to generate things they're writing, poetry or prose. But this particular novel, it's called La Liseuse, is a short, crisp, first-person narrative of the musings and experiences of a traditional Paris publisher confronted by the great upheaval in his firm and in his life made by the advent of the digital age. And it's really quite funny. One ray of light in his rather glum fin de carrière, because he can feel himself, he's going to be thrown out with the hard copy stuff fairly soon. But there is a little ray of light, is when a very recent recruit to his firm, almost by accident, takes on a new writer whose book suddenly becomes a hit. And the pair of them don't quite know what's hit them, but they set off on the obligatory grand tour of book signings all over France of this new hit novel, and the young publisher who's sort of traipsing her around to the following bookshops, because our narrator gets the bookshops he goes to is on the left there, to Géronimo, Kléber, Saurin, Mola, Le Furet, 5 of them, which you could say they're well known to contemporary French readers. It's well known where they are, and you could say they are used here as 5 metonyms for the 4 corners of the hexagon, which requires Euclid's geometry to be somewhat revised, but I mean that's the point. I mean they're dotted all around the country. So, is it one of the translator's tasks to tell non-French readers, but also, why not, French readers who happen to live in Quebec or La Réunion, know these things, where these places are, what this means in terms of geographical dispersal? Well, I thought it was. I chose to do it. And I chose to do it because actually it provided me with an opportunity not to be missed. I'm very grateful for this particular list, because Fournel's novel La Liseuse, which I call Dear Reader in English, is not entirely what it seems at first glance. It is a piece of formal composition, as well as being a first-person narrative of a publisher's life. It's structured not by games with letters, like Perec's famous Avoid, which doesn't use it. It's structured, again, by numbers, by character count. Each of its chapters has a quite specific number of letters, including blanks, spaces and signs. It's organized like this. Chapters 1 through 6 consist of 7,500 characters and spaces. Chapters 7 through 12, 6,500. 13 through 18, 5, etc., down to the last 6, 31 to 36, which are 2,500 characters and spaces each, making a total of 180,000 characters and spaces the novels out. You get two different effects from the shortening chapters. One, of course, is a falling away, the entropy of all things, and the other, of course, is the narrative speeding up. You can take it whichever way you like. There are other features to it, but I'll just deal with those, because it then becomes very ironical as you realize that this lament for the old world of ink, and paper, and compositors and hot type is something that can only have been done on a PC or a Mac with a letter count. Okay, well, obviously I could have translated the whole thing in plain prose and taken no notice of this character count constraint, and it is extremely unlikely that anybody would have noticed. It really is invisible. That's because Fournel writes French very well indeed, and the constraint as it causes him to write well, write very crisply but very firmly. So, I mean, if I decided not to do that, but to try and conform to the constraint myself as well in English, well, I suppose it's because I've learned from experience that meeting a formal constraint does actually make you write better. It can lead you to better solutions than doing that sort of floppy thing or plain translation. Plain translation is all right, but formal translation is often a step or two above, because you have to think much, much harder about the words you're using. The specific problem that account-based text creates between English and French is that there is a pretty standard fixed proportion between the two languages. French takes more words and letters to say something than English does. And everybody knows this in the publishing trade. It's standard that a text translated from French to English usually shrinks by about 10% if you just do it straight through. And the other way around, English to French, it sometimes expands by as much as 15%. It's not quite symmetric. And that's of all types of text, provided they're of a certain length. I mean, it won't necessarily happen with every paragraph, but once you got beyond 10 or 15 pages, it tends towards that average figure. So, obviously, a first draft of a chapter of La Liseuse typically falls short by an appreciable margin. So, what can I do? Well, English is a very flexible language. There are all sorts of forms of circumlocution, periphrasis, expansion, I mean, padding, all these things that students are so wonderful at with their term papers. You can, but, it would be a pity to treat Fournel's extremely elegant, precise, and accurate French in that way and just sort of add bits, and bulk it up with fluff. Because it would, well, you could, but it's unfortunate to do that. So that's why, I had this wonderful opportunity to, whoops. No, I'm sorry, I'll try and go back. Oh, what have I done to myself? Help. Oh, there we are. Got back, exactly where I want to be. Yeah, you can probably guess what I did to it now. I realized that I should adopt the other perspective and think of the unfortunate prolixity of the French language as having obliged Paul Fournel to leave things out that I could put back in. And so my lady novelist and her publishing representative got on a slightly longer tour that had to be cut short in French. And magically, that particular list of French cities got that chapter all by itself back to target level, back to the exact number that I wanted. So, trivial, yeah. Fun, definitely. But, I mean, and also meaningful, I think, that there are texts that require a translator to be flexible about what is actually in the text and what is not, which are the values that are more important to preserve. And I certainly think it's more important to preserve a fairly spare kind of English than to preserve the names of just 5 French bookshops. I think the added value of extending it is greater than any notion of sticking to what the original actually said would be. My fourth point, issue, example, is to do with the strange idea that people have had for a very long time that translating involves going from one language to another, from language A to language B. Take any piece of English prose you might come across in the next 2 hours, please, and just read through it and see how far you have to go until you find a word or an expression that is not in English. And I will bet you that you will find it within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 25 minutes perhaps if you're reading sports reports, but even then. The lag is never very long because, in fact, although it is possible, it is not at all common to write anything in just one language. I mean, I'm not saying this because hybrid texts are all the fashion, you know. There's some wonderful ones like Lydie Salvert's recent Goncourt winning novel called Pas pleurer, which is sort of in a lovely movement back and forth between French and Catalan. The hopscotch between languages is as old as writing itself, and I think it is endemic to the use of language as well. I just go back to Les Misérables. I mean, people think of it as a book written in French. Well, it is, except it's got bits of English, Spanish, Catalan, Provençal, Italian, and huge chunks of Latin in it as well. It is, I would say, it's about 93% in French. In the Simenon novel I mentioned at the beginning, there is a passage in Dutch and another passage in a specially invented language called Polkod. And in Perec's Life of Users Manual, which is my favorite book of all time anyway, is absolutely champion in this respect, as in so many others, because he manages to get in tiny little snippets of Hungarian, Hebrew, German, English, Japanese, Italian, Spanish, Latin, and math. So you might be able to add one or two to that, but those are the ones that I remember. And obviously a translator of works like that, which is any work, all work, does have to make a judgment, a decision, as to whether to help the English reader by translating what I call L3, I mean the third language, L3 to N, yeah, into the target language, or leaving them in the original in the translation, because of course, you know, what Latin means in a French novel of the 19th century is not necessarily what Latin means in an English novel of the 20th century. You know, it's not just a question of fidelity, it's a question of understanding how the relations between these languages are constructed and reconstructed. So that's a whole area that is absolutely fascinating, and where translators both have to become much more learned than they thought they needed to be, and take advice from others and learn other languages, even just for a little snippet, to know what it is that they're translating, and where obviously a translator's task goes far beyond the bounds usually ascribed to it in translation studies or by Walter Benjamin. But I'd just like to mention one rather special novel, special book in this respect that appeared recently in English, and that's a novel by the Albanian writer Ismail Kadare, Twilight of the Eastern Gods. It was published in Albanian in 1978. The parts of it appeared several years before that. And it's a fictionalized account of Kadare's own student years in Moscow between 1950 and 1960 during the Pasternak affair. Kadare was a visiting foreign student at the Gorky Institute for World Literature, and just to prove it, I've actually found. Oh, why don't you do it in the morning? That's it. There we are. There they all are. They're the teachers in the square frames and the students in the oval. And Kadare himself is that young man there with the glasses. Now, the Gorky Institute took in foreign students from all the 16 Soviet republics, from the satellite countries in Eastern Europe, and from China, and from one or two other countries. So there were as many different languages known in the Gorky Institute as there were students. And their interlanguage, their common language, of course, was Russian. And they all spoke it rather badly, or not perfectly, or were aware of not speaking it terribly well. Kadare's novel was translated from Albanian into French fairly quickly by Yusuf Vrioni in 1981. And I translated it from Vrioni's French into English. Now, the whole story of Yusuf Vrioni is quite special, and I can't go into it now, but he was an Albanian nobleman who'd been educated and lived as a playboy in Italy and France in the 1930s, had come back to Albania to participate in the new Albania in 1945 and was promptly thrown in jail. He got himself out of jail by translating the works of Enver Hoxha into French, and in his spare time, to keep himself sane, he translated Kadare into French as well. Vrioni did not know Russian. Yeah, because it was the wrong generation. And his idea of French style was one formed in the 1930s from Gide and Valéry, it's that kind of pre-war elegance in French. Kadare, on the other hand, born 1936, was at school in Albania in the 1940s and 50s and then to Moscow, was completely fluent reader and speaker of Russian, because Russian was the first foreign language taught in Albania. And so he could also assume that his audience for a novel published in 1978 would also have, or at least still remember, quite a lot of what was their first foreign language, or if they were more elite, they would be completely fluent in it at that time, even though Albania had, of course, broken off all relations with the Soviet Union. Okay, so I'm reading, therefore, a French novel in a language I know to be less rich than the Albanian, which represents an Albanian implementation of characters living in Moscow and talking to each other in Russian. Right? Yeah, it sounds complicated, but it's not that complicated. But that's what happens. Yeah? And even through that long filter, because I do know some Russian, I know what they are talking about, you know? When they are talking about aspects of grammar, or the grammar of aspect, or stress when they get wrong, and quoting lines of verse, or misquoting lines of verse that Vrioni doesn't really recognize, but they're very famous. I mean, Kadare didn't really complicate bits of Pushkin that everybody knows. So I felt that so many years have passed, the world has changed so much, that my task as a translator of a work like this was to be a little bit of an archaeologist and to dig up and to bring to life the kind of language reality, or a representation of the language reality, well, of a world, you know, I was a little boy at the time, but I can sort of remember when, you know, Moscow was the cultural center for half the world's population. It was the real exciting place to be for a lad from Tirana, you know. I mean, it had department stores, it had trolley buses, electric lights. It was fantastic, and there were people called Yevtushenko wandering around, and Bela Ahmadulina. So I re-Russianized it up to a point. I put more explicit words relating to Russian essence and what they're talking about. I even went so far as to put in one little quotation in verse in Cyrillic script. Now, Ismail is a good friend. He's still alive. He's a very grumpy old man. And he hated it. He really didn't want me to do that. And of course, it's because the world there has changed too. And in Tirana now, you don't want to know Russian. You don't want to remember you knew Russian. Kadare, I've even heard him lie through his back teeth, saying, no, he doesn't speak Russian. No. But it is his language of education and culture. So the task of the translator there is also to be, well, on the one hand, perform a kind of a long-range service to something that really has disappeared, and the other hand to be a diplomat, and in the end to take responsibility for overruling the author of the work as to how it should be construed in English. We're still good friends, but you know, for him now, he says, to see a line of Cyrillic in a book with his name on it makes him feel ill. And well, maybe it does, but it's still the right, in my view, the right thing to do for a 21st century Anglophone readership who actually also haven't ever seen a sentence in Cyrillic before, to make it look strange and to make people realize there was a whole other world there. And that's what it looked like. Okay, so there we are. I haven't told you what the task of the translator is, but I think I hope to have told you that of 4 tasks that face a translator, me and others, and they're really interesting. They all go beyond the text itself, even in the most formal cases. The translator, a translator is always obliged to find out more than what's actually on the page. And one of the things that I say in That a Fish in Your Ear, and which I really want to insist on again and again, is that no text, I mean, it doesn't have to be a poem by Baudelaire, but no text contains all the information you need to translate it. That is not in the nature of a written text, to be translatable or indeed readable in and for itself. And that is why that it is not so much the nature of the source that makes translating a creative act. It is the nature of language, and especially written language, and its relationship to the world, that makes translating always, maybe only a little bit, sometimes a lot, but always to some degree, a creative act, because you cannot but create through the work of the translator. So there you are. That's my excuse for the kinds of games I play, for what I do. What I will say is that these tasks of the translator are obviously very many. They are very different. They are infinitely varied. And that's why actually translating, I mean, it's a serious job, but you know, there's never a dull day, and it's always fun. So thank you.